This is definitely a special night, and I'm very happy and indeed excited to share it with you. And today, 22nd of April, we celebrate Immanuel Kant's 300th birthday. Though there is no need to mention to an audience like that who are engaged and inspired by this great mind, no doubt that Kant is one of the most influential figures in the history of philosophy. Tonight, we would like to honor Kant's legacy by the fourth of our talk series, Kant and the Needs of Reason. As Türkiye Kant Society, we are very pleased to host a very special guest, which would, I believe, cherish this exceptional occasion. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my distinct honor and privilege to introduce our esteemed speaker for this evening, Professor Alan Wood. A towering figure in the world of philosophy, Professor Wood is renowned internationally for his profound scholarship and expertise in the works of Kant. His interests are in the history of modern philosophy, especially in Kant and German idealism, and in ethics and social philosophy. With a career spanning decades, Professor Wood has provided rigorous examination and elucidation of Kantian philosophy, offering invaluable insights into its complexities and nuances. With Paul Guyer, Professor Wood is co-general editor of the Cambridge edition of the Kant's writing, for which he has edited, translated, or otherwise contributed to 6 volumes. He published several books and articles not only on Kant, but also on Fichte, Hegel, and Marx. His books have been translated into Hebrew, Turkish, Portuguese, Iranian, and Chinese. And as a side note, I am happy to announce that his 1999 Kant's Ethical Thought, which has been a classical source book now, has been translated into Turkish by me and my friend Umut Eldem, and it will be published soon by Vakıfbank Kültür Yayınları. As I mentioned, Wood published numberless books and articles on broad topics, and we would run out of time if we list them all. But nevertheless, I would like to mention at least some of them by name. Kant and Religion, 2020, Fichte's Ethical Thought, 2016, Free Development of Each, 2014, and Hegel's Ethical Thought, 1990. In sum, as we gather to commemorate the 300th birthday of Immanuel Kant, there could be no better guide than Professor Alan Wood to lead us on another journey of exploration into the rich legacy of one of the world's greatest philosophers. Please join me in extending a warm welcome to Professor Alan Wood for his talk, Kant and Moral Faith and the Place of Human Beings in Nature. And Professor Wood, floor is yours.
Okay, well, thank you very much. And now I will begin. Each of Kant's 3 critiques ends with a methodology or doctrine of method. In all 3 critiques, Kant places near the end of his book a statement of Kant's moral argument for rational faith in God. And in the 3rd critique, this argument occupies most of the methodology of teleological judgment. I've written elsewhere about this argument and even about what is distinctive in the presentation of it in the 3rd critique. But I need to say something about that here as well. What is most distinctive about the methodology of the 3rd critique is the way Kant frames the end of the highest good by attempting a systematization of natural teleology and a combination of natural with moral teleology. This attempt constitutes a distinctive presentation of Kant's entire ethical theory, and especially of the moral relation of the human species to the rest of nature. It is that aspect of the methodology that I will hope to discuss later in this talk. But first, I should say something about the moral argument for faith, how it is to be understood, and what it is supposed to establish. Because it is offered as an argument for assent to the existence of a traditional monotheistic God, Kant's moral argument is very often compared, usually to its detriment, with the familiar theistic proofs that Kant, along with Hume, is thought to have demolished in the Critique of Pure Reason. Because it is described as a moral argument, people often think of it either as something designed to make morally better human beings of us, or else as a piece of wishful thinking, grounded on perhaps irrational wishes we are supposed to approve because morality supposedly approves of them. But Kant's argument is none of these. In all three critiques, in the third, it comes in the final section, section 91, Kant is careful to distinguish the kind of assent or affirmation, the German word is Fürwahrhalten, that he takes the moral argument to justify. And while he calls this species of assent faith or belief, the German word is Glaube, it is different in important respects from what we ordinarily think of as belief in ordinary English or Glaube in ordinary German. Kant's argument is based on a claim that the conditions for rational action, and more specifically for rational setting of an end, of a Zweck, I may wish for something I know to be impossible, but in order to set an end, I must suppose it to be possible. The end must be possible. Every action, as Kant understands it, involves setting some object or future state of affairs as an end to be effected. In order to do this irrationally, I must suppose that that state of affairs is at least possible, and that I can do something that at least tends to contribute to bringing it about. I need not be certain that it will come about, or even that I can do anything affecting it. But it would be irrational for me to set an end if I were certain that it is impossible of attainment, or that I am powerless to do anything even to contribute to its occurrence. This sets up a relation between purposive volition and rational assent. If I'm certain that a certain state of affairs is impossible, then I cannot rationally set it as an end. But if I'm uncertain whether a state of affairs is possible, or whether I can contribute to bringing it about, then it is still possible for me rationally to will it as an end. But in order to do this, I must accept a rational commitment to assent to the possibility of this end and to the possibility of my making a contribution to it. This assent need not take the form of what we normally call belief. That is, it need not be a habitual assent rationally justified by some theoretical proof or evidence. It may instead be a disposition to assent simply for practical purposes and on practical grounds. It might be sufficient to justify this assent that I don't know that the end is impossible. Our attitude here toward the success of our efforts need not and should not be merely wishful thinking, since it may be and should be accompanied by sober appreciation of the likelihood of the end and of the obstacles to its success. But it certainly must involve hope for progress toward our end, and it may also involve what we could call faith in the cause for which we are working. Kant habitually applies this way of thinking to historical causes that matter most to him, such as the quest for peace between nations, or the progress of a political state toward a true condition of right, or of the human species towards its own moral improvement. It is this same hopeful attitude that he is expressing in his moral argument for faith in God. Here, the end he claims we have a moral duty to set is the comprehensive good of the world, regarded from the moral standpoint as the highest good. And he argues that the condition for the possibility of this end, as an object of striving for each of us and of the human species collectively, is the existence of an author of the world, a God that answers to the traditional religious concept of God. Kant's moral argument does not offer us any kind of evidence or proof that there is a God. In that sense, it does not justify belief in God's existence. Kant's argument does not aim at manipulating us into having such a belief, perhaps supposedly as a way of making better people of us. On the contrary, it addresses itself to us as moral agents who are already supposed to be virtuous enough to seek the ends of morality, and perhaps also philosophically to systematic enough to unite these ends into a totality under the title of the highest good. Kant's term for the doxastic state, the argument it seeks to produce, is, as we have seen, assent or affirmation, Bewahrheitung. He also describes it sometimes as acceptance or assumption, annehmen, especially acceptance in a practical respect, for a practical purpose, or from a practical point of view. These are all ways of speaking that he uses. We do not speak of believing something only in certain respects, or only for certain purposes, or only from a certain point of view. But we assent to assume or accept certain propositions in these ways. A mathematician or inquirer assents to certain assumptions in order to prove or disprove either them or something else, or perhaps to make certain discoveries. As Kant himself points out, a physician may assent to a certain diagnosis for the purpose of treating certain symptoms in a patient. In an analogous way, Kant's moral faith in God consists in the acceptance of the claim that God exists for the purpose of rationally setting the highest good as an end. It's acceptance for that purpose, or in respect of our practical striving, or from the standpoint of moral striving. If, as Kant hopes, in the case of a virtuous moral agent, the striving pervades the life of the moral agent, then this assent or acceptance will not be merely limited or temporary, as might happen in the case of a mathematician or inquirer or our physician in the example I talked about, but it will be habitual in the person's life. So it might therefore be, as Kant says it should be, a habitus, or a way of thinking. But I think it still falls short of what we would call belief. This habitual faith can and should persist in the presence of objective theoretical uncertainty about both the existence of God and the likelihood of the highest good. It can and should be consistent with sober reflection on these uncertainties. And this is why Kant said the faith that it justifies can be a doubting faith. Zweifelglaube is the German word, for which the lack of conviction on the basis of grounds of speculative reason is only an obstacle. Insight into the speculative reason can deprive it of influence on conduct and substitute for it a practical affirmation that outweighs it. Perhaps people think of Kant's moral argument as weak or half-hearted because it doesn't justify what we usually call belief, but something in certain respects weaker than that. But what it does justify is what our rational considerations considered as a whole might actually justify. It's only our practical commitment to the pursuit of the moral end that grounds our assent, and not any self-deceptive belief based on a motivated distortion of the evidence concerning God's existence or the likelihood of achieving the highest good. In this way, Kant's moral argument is not the least bit like the speculative theistic proofs that he famously discredited, and the doxastic state it aims at producing is quite different from what these proofs would have produced if they had been successful. Thus far, we have considered the highest good merely as the comprehensive end of moral striving. We might wonder why Kant thinks the moral agent must set such a comprehensive end, especially in view of the fact that Kant denies that this end adds anything to our duties. It merely offers us a special point of reference for the unification of all our moral ends. So we might also question whether it is necessary to assume or accept the existence of a traditional monotheistic God in order to think of the highest good as possible of attainment. So these are two questions. Where does the idea of the highest good come from? How do we conceive of it? And second, why do we think that its possibility requires acceptance of the idea of the existence of God? The methodology of teleological judgment in the third critique has something distinctive to say about both these matters. So, why is it only a supremely perfect God able to do what is necessary for the highest good? And why must this be a God separate from nature? Why not simply identify God with the moral order of the world, as Fichte was later to do? Whether or not we find it convincing, in the third critique, Kant does give us a new and distinctive answer to both of the questions we've raised. There is no inference in Kant's account in the third critique from a moral teleology to a theology. He describes the theology that results as what he calls an ethico-theology. That is, we form a concept of God based on our ethical views, not on any views about how the world might have come about or how it is being ordered by a creator or a world governor. Instead, there's only the inference to a final end of creation, to an end that we as rational beings set when we reflect on teleology, both of nature and morality, and when we try to grasp them together as a systematic whole. What more precisely Kant means by a final end of creation will be explored a bit later in this talk. But when it comes to deciding what could make possible the achievement of such an end, Kant now makes it clear that we cannot answer this question from a speculative or metaphysical standpoint. We cannot know how, in itself, the world or its cause would have to be constituted in order to make possible a world in which, as he thinks of it as the highest good, happiness is proportioned to worthiness, or for human beings to be under moral laws, another formula he uses in the third critique to describe the highest good. The most we can do, Kant says, is to determine how, according to the constitution of our faculties, we are capable of thinking of the cause of a nature which is the highest good realized. When we think of a God that is an intelligent and moral being, author of the world, We do so, as he says, merely for the power of judgment in accordance with principles of practical reason, and for reflecting, and the reflecting power of judgment, not the determining power of judgment. That is, we cannot proceed from some pre-given concept, such as that of an omniscient, omnipotent, and supremely good deity, and then determine the cause of the world according to that concept. Instead, we must consider the final end of the world as we set it for ourselves, and then seek out through reflective judgment for the concept of a being that enables us to comprehend how such a final end of the world might be brought about. Kant, in other words, does not intend to make an objective metaphysical claim about what the world's cause must be in order to make the highest good possible. That would be a piece of transcendent metaphysics, discredited by the critical philosophy. Instead, what we claim is only about how our faculties are constituted, and more specifically, how we are capable of thinking of the world in which the moral end might be possible. Kant's conception of reflective judgment is that it is a faculty through which a given manifold of representations can be brought together and unified in one consciousness. The third critique understands natural teleology this way. For instance, the purposiveness found in living organisms, not as a special causality through which the processes of organized beings are caused, but instead as the way in which we may unify our understanding of these processes, given the constitution of our cognitive faculties. Kant wants to consider our concept of the world's author as making possible the highest moral good. In a fashion parallel to this, it tells us, in other words, nothing about God's nature considered in itself, but it merely tells us how we are capable of thinking of the world's cause in relation to the final end of the world as our moral teleology conceives it. This consorts well, I suggest, with Kant's claim also in the third critique, but he uses this claim in The Religion quite often and in other works, that Kant's claim that all of our cognition of God's nature must be symbolic. That's a key term in his description of how we can conceive of God. Every cognition, according to Kant, even every intelligible thought must involve both conception and intuition, both understanding and sensibility. The sensible side of any thought Kant calls a hypotyposis. For empirical thoughts, a hypotyposis is given through sensibility, sensible images of something that we experience. For pure concepts of the understanding, such as the categories, it is given as a direct hypotyposis through what Kant calls schemata of the transcendental imagination. For ideas of reason, however, no direct hypotyposis is possible. The intuitive or sensible side of thoughts of such pure concepts must be indirect. And this indirect hypotyposis is what Kant calls a symbol. The symbol contrasts with a schema. Symbols operate through analogy, by which he means not a similarity between objects, but a sameness in our way of thinking about them. Thoughts involving an idea of reason, such as the idea of God, require that we employ symbols drawn from our own faculties, such as understanding and will. When we try to conceive of the ground of nature as conforming to our comprehensive moral end of the highest good, the symbol most suitable is that of an understanding and a will that combines omniscience, omnipotence, and moral perfection. But this symbolic thought tells us nothing about God's nature, for that is incomprehensible to us. The thoughts we have are only, quote, subjectively necessary or valid for the reflected and not the objectively determining power of judgment. Such thoughts might be employed constitutively if we applied them practically to our own faculties. But as applied to the cause of the world in relation to its final end, the thought of these same faculties by no means is theoretically determining as a principle for judging the objective possibility of things, but is rather merely regulative principle for the reflective power of judgment. As a response to the skeptical worries about how Kant's moral argument is supposed to justify assent to the existence of a God in the traditional sense, this may seem far from satisfactory if what we wanted is the kind of assurance we would hope for from a speculative metaphysical theistic proof. And of course, those proofs are what Kant thinks we cannot have. It seems, in fact, to concede to the skeptic that we can never determine the nature of the being whose existence we are to assent to rationally in order to set the highest good as an end. But it is consistent with Kant's position to claim that any concept we have of God is not objectively determining, but is only symbolic, using our concepts of our own faculties of understanding and will as a way of unifying our representations of the moral final end according to our own reflecting judgment. If critics want to defend an alternative conception of a deity, then Kant would challenge them by claiming that this would be, they would be unable to justify their alternative in any other terms than those Kant has proposed for a symbolic conception of God. The message I think we should take away from Kant's discussion in the third critique is to turn our attention to our commitment to moral ends and the hope and faith needed to pursue them, while pressing on all of us, whether we consider ourselves theistic believers or unbelievers, how little we understand of what we are thinking when we say we're thinking about God, whether to express faith or doubt about God's existence. Well, now let's turn to what the third critique has to say about the highest good, since that is a distinctive presentation as well. In the third critique, Kant arrives at the highest good as the comprehensive end of moral action, and he does it in a new way. He also gives us a look at his entire ethical theory from a new perspective. Kant seeks by means of reason to make a system of ends out of the aggregate of purposefully formed things, which of course would be mainly living things. For Kant, a system of anything is a unity of the manifold of cognitions under one idea in the special sense of a pure concept of the understanding or of reason. The system Kant then describes is one human reason creates. Such a system is one we may, dürfen, form. It's not one forced on us, either by metaphysical arguments or by empirical evidence. Any requirement to form it is one which our reason imposes on itself regulatively in order to further our systematic understanding of nature. The system Kant then projects is quite similar to what we find in certain passages in Aristotle. Kant had little or no firsthand knowledge of the works of Aristotle. Maybe this is surprising, but I think it's true. What he knows about Aristotle is mainly through Brooker's historical history of philosophy. But his discussion of the systematic teleology of nature and its relation to the ends of reason does share in some important concepts and theses found in the first book of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. There, right at the beginning of the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle proposes to systematize ends by bringing a multiplicity of ends under a common unifying end that, in Aristotle's term, is more final or more complete, teleuteron is the Greek word, than those it unifies. His example is taken from Greek military horsemanship, bridle making, and the other arts relating to the care and use of horses are brought under the art of horsemanship. And this art, at least in the ancient Greek military context, is then brought under military strategy. And it, in turn, serves, along with other arts, such as political science, to promote the ultimate end here, the happiness or flourishing of a polis. In a parallel way, Kant seeks to unify natural ends by bringing them finally under an ultimate end. The German term is letzter Zweck. He has considered Linnaeus's treatment of external teleology in this context, according to which plants served as a means to feed herbivorous animals and herbivores as means to feed carnivores, or alternatively, also suggested in Linnaeus, the end of limiting the population of herbivores. The carnivores limit the population of herbivores, and herbivores might limit the growth of plants. Kant dismisses this way of unifying teleology because it cannot lead to the unification required for a system, which requires an ultimate end. And in the system of living things, there is no ultimate end. Kant also points out that if human beings considered other living things as means to their survival or to other ends, then it is equally true that human beings serve other parts of nature as means, as when a human corpse serves as food for worms. You could then begin with any natural, if you tried systematizing ends in this way, you could begin with any one natural end and treat others as means to it. But you would never find in this unification an ultimate end that is used to make a system of ends in Kant's sense, or Aristotle's sense too. Kant therefore seeks an ultimate end for a system of natural purposes through a different strategy. He argues that only the human being can be considered nature's ultimate end, since he is the only being on earth that forms the concept of ends for himself, and by means of this reason can make a system of ends. But this argument is rather opaque, and it is not immediately clear what it is supposed to mean to say that the human being is nature's ultimate end. There would seem to be no reason at all why that unique being who can think about ends and systematize ends should be entitled to appoint itself as the ultimate end of the system, especially if we think that what this means is that it arrogates to itself the status of being the one whose welfare and volitions the whole of nature are supposed to serve. This would look like a rather arrogant way for human beings to think of themselves as the ultimate end of nature. And I think we'll see that's not the way that Kant does it. When we look more closely at the third critique, we see that this is very far from what Kant means, and even close to its diametric opposite. Kant dismisses almost with contempt the thought that human happiness is even an end of nature, much less its ultimate end. Kant does hold that for each of us, our own happiness is an end of our prudential reason, and that the happiness of others, other human beings, is an end of morality. But he denies that human happiness is any end of nature at all. Our desire for happiness, according to Kant, is rather nature's device to make us discontented, overcoming our natural tendency toward lethargy, and inciting us to develop our capacities and predispositions, which is the natural end of our rationality. We could even say that for Kant, the human desire for happiness serves its natural purpose precisely through its own frustration. By making us unhappy, our desire for happiness prods us to develop our species capacities. Thus, we must ask again, what does it mean to say that the human being is the ultimate end of nature? And by what reasoning does Kant reach this puzzling conclusion? In order to understand Kant's conception of a system of ends, we need yet another concept that can be found in Aristotle, which we can distinguish from that of an ultimate end, and which we could call a final end, Endzweck. Kant's terms are this. Letzter Zweck and Endzweck are the two terms. For Aristotle, ends and goods come with degrees of finality or completeness. And the most final, teleotaton, this Greek word, will be that which is desired solely for itself and in no way pursued for the sake of anything else. We see this is not the case with the existence of human beings as ultimate ends of nature. We've seen we could look upon human beings as the ends of other living things, as well as looking at other living things as means to the ends of human ends. So Kant puts the idea of a Endzweck, a final end, as that end that needs no other as a condition of its possibility. Another way Kant distinguishes the concept of a final end is to call it an absolute end, in contrast to relative ends, ends that have value or a rational claim only because their relation to the volitions of a being that sets them. Kant's claim that a system of ends is truly complete as a system is only if it is unified by a final end, not just an ultimate end, but a final end, an end to which all others serve as means, while it serves and can serve as a means to no other end beyond itself, because it is complete in itself. In saying that the human being is the ultimate end, Kant is saying that the human being's vocation, Bestimmung, to unite all natural ends into a system, and to do this by setting for the world a final end. See, that's what it means to say that we are the ultimate end of nature, is that we alone can set a final end for nature. Natural ends, those involved in the existence and functioning of living organisms, even human beings as living organisms, cannot be final ends, not only because they can serve as means for other organisms, but also because no natural end is an end because it is set as an end by a being capable of forming the concept of an end. Natural ends are ends only in virtue of the way they unite the cognitions of a rational being, which unites its cognitions through them by reflective judgment. But it is only such a rational being that can actually set an end. And hence it is only through such a being that a final end for creation is possible. This capacity to set a final end is what makes the human being uniquely situated to be the ultimate end of nature. The human vocation, therefore, is to be able to set and pursue a final end for the world, to which the whole of nature can be teleologically subordinated. This also helps us to understand what Kant means when he says the final world, or end of the world, is beyond nature. He does not mean that it is to be found in a supernatural world or a supernatural being. What he means is rather this: the final end cannot be an end that nature would be sufficient to produce in accordance with the idea of an end, because it's the end of an intelligent cause. In other words, it must be an end that human reason sets as an end of human actions, since human reason is the only thing we know of that can set or conceive of ends or systematize them. It's also an end to be achieved in the world through freedom. The world's final end, therefore, is not a natural end whose concept is employed by a reflective judgment in our understanding of nature. It's rather a supreme end that moral beings must set for themselves. The concept of this end not only unites the system of natural ends, but also combines natural teleology with moral teleology. The final end, therefore, is that of the highest good, or the human being under moral laws. It's the end that we focus on in the moral argument for God's existence. This provides the third critique with a new account of why, as moral beings, we have a duty to set the highest good as an end, and therefore have a reason to assent to the existence of God as a condition of its possibility. Really, as we've seen, it's not objectively a condition of its possibility. It's a condition of our reflective judgment, thinking about the possibility of that end. We do this in order to fulfill our human vocation to be the ultimate end of nature. We now can see how Kant's methodological reflections in the third critique on how natural teleology and the unification of natural teleology with moral teleology do offer us a presentation of Kant's ethics that is unique in his philosophical writings. To understand our moral vocation as that of being the ultimate end of nature requires us to look at the natural world and our place in it in a special way. Because human beings are the only ones who can form the concept of an end, and that of a system of ends united by an ultimate end, they must see their capacity to set and systematize ends as uniquely situated in relation to any system of natural ends. When we consider any possible system of natural ends from a moral point of view, and unify it with our moral system of ends, then we human beings ought to assume the responsibility, as far as we can, for making nature into a harmonious teleological system. And we ought to harmonize our own volitions and actions with our rational volitions as the ultimate end of nature. And here's a quotation. As the sole being on earth that has reason and a capacity to set voluntary ends, the human being is certainly the titular lord of nature. And if nature is regarded as a teleological system, it is his vocation, Bestimmung, to be the ultimate end of nature. In this passage, there's heavy irony in the phrase titular lord of nature. For his point is that our being the ultimate end of nature is not really a right or privilege to be exercised for our own benefit, still less for that of our whims and caprices. It's instead a vocation that imposes duties on us. We have the responsibility, the duty, to make ourselves into the ultimate end of nature by setting the right ends and even setting a final end, an Endzweck, for ourselves and for nature as a whole. And therefore, we have a duty to fashion ourselves and our conduct accordingly. If we look at natural ends as forming the kind of teleological hierarchy we've just described, then we should look at nature as constituting a kind of teleological system, not merely one in which, perhaps following the reflections of Linnaeus, every organism serves as both an end and a means to the life of other organisms, but instead as a system pointing toward a single ultimate end for the entire harmonious structure. In fact, a final end for the structure. And we see ourselves and our moral duties as marking us off as the ultimate end that unifies this system by forming the concept of a final end, and to treat as one of our duties to understand the harmony of nature through our ends and our actions, to contribute to this harmony. It is therefore contrary to our moral duty to disrupt the natural harmony of natural ends, or to adopt ends that tend to disrupt it. This is a way of looking at our duties in regards to non-rational beings in nature, in regard to nature itself as a whole. Kant holds that we have duties toward ourselves not to destroy what is beautiful in nature, and also to treat non-rational beings in nature not violently and cruelly, but kindly, and with other, we'll see shortly, with certain other moral properties. Kant never grounds these duties explicitly on our vocation to make ourselves the ultimate end of nature. But he is doing so implicitly here, I think, in the methodology of the critique of the power of judgment. It also helps to explain why we must regard these duties as duties to ourselves and not to any other being, because they're duties to our vocation as the ultimate end of nature. But they're not duties only toward other human beings who might benefit or at least not be harmed by our kindness toward non-rational animals and our preservation of natural beauty. It's also a way of looking at the final end, Endzweck, that human beings are to set as part of their vocation as nature's ultimate end. It is, so to speak, the aspect of that final end that faces toward the rest of nature. The topic of Kant on our duties to nature raises issues about what duties, if any, Kant thinks we have toward non-human animals and other natural beings. Kant holds that we have duties toward, gegen, only finite rational beings, other human beings, basically, ourselves and other rational beings. Because it is only such beings who have a rational will with which we can be empirically acquainted, and whose will, therefore, can be an auctor obligationis, an author of obligation, which imposes duties on our rational will. That's what it means to be a duty, have a duty toward a being, gegen. But he holds we can still have duties toward ourselves and in regard to, in Ansehung auf, some being toward which we cannot have duties. And in the Metaphysical Morals, he distinguishes three such beings, three kinds of such beings. One is the beauties of nature. The other is non-rational animal. And the third one is God. Natural beauty and non-rational animals, we cannot have duties toward them because they have no rational will. God may have the rational will. We assume as a part of our concept of God that God does have a rational will, but it is not one with which we can be empirically acquainted. So this is why the beauties of nature, other animal, non-rational animals, and God are the three things in regard to which we have duties, but toward which we cannot have duties. In the case of animals, Kant holds that they are analogs of humanity. We are likely to resist Kant's claim that in contrast to human persons, animals are only things. That's a claim he makes right at the beginning of the Anthropology. But if animals are analogs of humanity, then they are not merely what we think of as things. Or if they are things of a very special sort. Analogy, in Kant's sense, does not refer, as we've already seen actually, to a similarity between objects, though analogs are sometimes similar and sometimes not. In Kant's sense, X is an analog of Y if we think of X in the same way that we think of Y. Thus, if an animal shows us his examples of this, he doesn't tell us all the ways in which we can think of animals and human beings in the same way. I think there are many questions about that Kant does not try to answer. But he thinks that if an animal shows us affection or gives us service, then we should think about it in the same way that we think about a human friend or servant. And we acquire duties in regard to the animal that are similar to duties of friendship or gratitude. Further, when we see animals desiring, preferring, and caring for humans or for members of their own kind, or when we see them suffering, that is, feeling pleasure and pain, we then think of them in the same way that we think of human beings when they are in similar states or display similar behaviors. Kant says our treatment of animals cultivates our duty to humanity and sometimes suggests that we should practice kindness toward animals on the ground that we thereby cultivate the right attitudes toward human beings. This might suggest, and some people who have written about this seem to think it is Kant's view, that he considers fulfillment of these duties in regard to animals as merely a means toward treating other humans kindly, and that he regards animals as having therefore only instrumental value. But that thought is, I think, a serious misunderstanding of his position. Kant categorizes duties in regard to animals as duties toward ourselves, not duties toward other human beings. If animals are analogs of humanity, and it is wrong to think of human beings as having only instrumental value, then it should be wrong to think of animals as mere means, or at least in the respects in which we should think of them in the same way that we think of humans. As I already suggested, this would be when we think of animals as like friends or servants or when we think of them as having a good that we should promote rather than frustrate. Kant thinks our cruel or callous treatment of animals, our failure to treat them with kindness and gratitude, quote, weakens and thereby gradually uproots a natural predisposition which belongs to our humanity. I think this is the way, the basic way, in which duties in regard to animals are duties to ourselves. They're duties not to disgrace or destroy our natural predispositions. Violation of duties in regard to animals harms a natural part of ourselves, which in itself has moral value. Harm to it is in itself wrong. And because animals are analogs of humanity, it is wrong in itself in the same way that callous or cruel treatment of other people is wrong in itself. So animals are not, for Kant, mere means to something. Some philosophers think of our duties regarding animals in terms of what they like to call moral standing or moral status. Some ask whether Kant thinks animals have any moral status at all. And they worry about this when Kant says that animals are things. They think things are beings without moral status, and therefore that Kant thinks animals have no moral status. Well, but I think this is the wrong way to understand Kant. I think the questions themselves, whether animals have moral status or what their moral status is in relation to the moral status of humans, I think these questions themselves are morally offensive. However, we should try to answer them. I reject the questions. As a matter of social history, the whole idea of moral status derives from the way some people in past societies and even down to the present time have been accorded higher or lower rank or status according to birth or social class or race or sex, with the implication that higher status means that they are owed greater respect or concern, greater privilege, greater power, wealth, honor than those with lower status. So I find all of these ways of thinking about people in past societies and in our present society as morally offensive. I think it's a monstrous history, which is still very much with us, the history of moral status. I think this history renders the whole concept of moral status morally offensive. In my view, the wrongness cannot be overcome by saying that all humans have the same or equal moral status, whatever we might take that claim to mean. When those who think in terms of moral status meet with Kantian concepts of dignity and end in itself, which apply to human beings, the usual reaction is to say that these are moral status concepts, and they accord all rational beings an equal status. But dignity, as Kant, in Kant's sense of the term, means, as he says, incomparable moral worth, which I take to be incompatible with their having equal moral worth, since equality is a comparative concept. Despite this, the notion of moral status leads to some questions about the moral status of non-human animals and whether their status is equal to that of humans or is perhaps lower than that of humans, but still high enough for us to use it to decide how animals should be treated. Is that what they're saying? But I think that no answer to such questions seems to me acceptable. I don't want to say that animals have equal status to humans, nor do I want to say that they have a lower status. It's the questions themselves that put us on the wrong track, simply because they presume the pernicious idea of comparative moral status. On Kant's moral theory, we may have duties sometimes to treat animals in the same way or similarly to human beings. But there is no ground for saying either that animals have the same moral status as humans or have a lesser or greater or equal moral status. For Kant, our duties either toward or in regard to a being depend more on the situation and the needs of that being or our relation to that being than they do on anything like that being's moral status. If, for example, a wild animal attacks my child, I ought to defend the child, even at the cost of the animal's life. But I have a duty to care for and feed a pet or a work animal that belongs to me, while I have no such general duty at all towards a human neighbor, unless that duty is created by extraordinary circumstances, such as the neighbors being in some special distress. As Kantian ethics views things, what matters are the capacities and behaviors of animals and our relations to them that ground all our duties in regard to them. These include the fact that animals may feel pleasure and pain, that they have desires and preferences, but not rational preferences or ends, right? They're not rational beings, so they can't set ends or have rational preferences. And also, quite prominently in Kant's account, many animals have the capacity to care about members of their own species and sometimes also about human beings. These are things that matter. Perhaps Kant's thesis that all rational beings are ends in themselves with dignity means that there is some abstract sense in which all human beings have the same worth. But this does not entail that they have the same moral status, even an equal one. See, I'm rejecting the whole idea of moral status. Whether we like it or not, Kantian ethics has no principles to the effect that we owe all beings an equal impartial concern, or especially that we ought to give them an equal amount of some good, happiness or welfare, pleasure or freedom from pain, opportunities, capabilities, or what have you. Different philosophers all ask. Equality of what? Amartya Sen wrote a well-known paper with that title, equality of what? Well, I'm saying there is no such thing, that either we owe equal amounts of to human beings or to anybody. Now, if it comes down to pleasure in the absence of pain, which, following Bentham and the utilitarian tradition, hedonism, as philosophers understand it, I think, gives us only a very shallow and one-sided measure of the good of any living organism. Pleasure and freedom from pain are, ceteris paribus, rationally choice-worthy for human beings. I'll certainly say that. But they matter mainly when lack of pleasure or excessive discomfort incapacitates us for the achievement of other important goods. Pleasures that incapacitate us, some pleasures do, such as, the pleasures of addictive drugs are, ceteris paribus, bad. Those pleasures are bad. And pain or discomfort that is a necessary component of meaningful achievement is good. Pleasure and pain are necessary parts of life of many organisms, and their natural function is to serve the normal activities and processes of that life. People sometimes reasonably choose to endure pain, especially when it is mild or simply mental discomfort, such as anxiety or deferred gratification, if the pain is necessary for the pursuit of some other more important good. In the case of non-human animals, therefore, we might, on their behalf, and with their good in mind, choose that they should live a life suited to their species, even in preference to a life that maximizes pleasure and freedom from pain. Okay, so now it's time to conclude. Kant's methodology of teleological judgment should be looked at as his attempt to provide a systematic account of the good of living things, both singly and collectively. It focuses on what human beings can consider the final good of the world, because human beings, as the only rational beings with which we are acquainted, are the only beings capable of forming the conceptions needed to inquire into the good of the world, and even to ask the questions necessary for such an inquiry. This is the only sense in which human being may be considered the ultimate end of nature. It should therefore not surprise us that the quest to determine such an end focuses on the moral good and the way the moral good conditions the value of other goods we are capable of recognizing. And this naturally leads us to ask after the conditions under which the final end might be possible of realization, and what assents we might need in order rationally to pursue that end. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Wood, not only accepting for our invitation for tonight, but for also this wonderful paper. We used to learn a lot from you, and that was also an exceptional paper in the third critique, so thank you so much. Yeah. Now we have the Q&A session, and I would like to invite the questions, and we will also try to synchronize the questions and type them on the chat so you can follow better if you wish, Professor Wood. Yes, I have a question, but I think I would rather wait later on to ask. I see Seniye's hand first. Seniye, please go ahead. If you are also able to type your question meanwhile on the chat, that would be perfect.
Yes, I actually just posted
okay,
on the chat.
You can also read it from the chat if you want, while she is also addressing the question.
Yes, so my question is this. So in the first critique, Kant quite frequently refers to God as the highest reason or the archetype of all reasons. In one passage, he even claims that human reason is a faint copy of this highest reason. And given that we need to assume in the first critique, or even postulate in the second critique, the existence of God, to make the most consistent use of our reason, can we infer that we can at least claim that God, if exists, is a rational being? So in your view, symbolic thought tells us nothing about God's nature, for that is incomprehensible to us. But symbolic thought can make this rational idea maybe comprehensible to us, precisely by allowing us to realize the symbolic similarity or analogy between humans, beings with finite reason, and God, a being with infinite reason. So even if we cannot possibly know if such a being actually exists, maybe we can have some comprehension of his nature, just as the symbolic cognition of a despotic state is made comprehensible to us by the idea of a handmill. What do you think? Thank you.
Yes, well, I think it's important to see that when Kant introduces the idea of God in the first critique, he introduces it only as the ens realissimum. Now that does not include a lot of the properties that we traditionally have associated with God. It just means that God contains the maximal degree of all perfections in the metaphysical sense. It produces what Kant elsewhere calls a deistic conception of God. It's a technical sense. It isn't what deism meant in a lot of the history of early modern philosophy, in which deism is a theological position. a deistic concept of God is a non-personal being. I think you could say that maybe the philosopher who has closest to what Kant calls the deistic conception of God would be Spinoza. It's a being that has, these properties. Now, Kant thinks that we can also form a different conception of God, which he calls a theistic conception, but we do so using symbolism, which I tried to explain in the talk. Symbolism is when we derive some of or what he sometimes calls cosmotheology, as opposed to ontotheology. Ontotheology produces a deistic conception of God. Cosmotheology allows us to draw analogs of properties of parts of the universe. In the case of God, they will be parts of ourselves, especially understanding and will. And when we do this, we form the concept of a God that could be a personal being. And that's what, for the purposes of religion, or I think even for the purposes of the moral argument, you need a theistic concept of God, not a merely deistic one. And of course, it's very hard to know in what ways we can think of God in the same way that we think of our understanding and our will. In his lectures on the philosophical theology or philosophical doctrine of religion, he does quite a bit to explain how we can form a symbolic concept of God. And he's giving us a pretty good account of the traditional scholastic rationalist conception of God that we find in a lot of medieval and early modern theology and all the monotheistic religions. I think, but you have to be careful in identifying what kind of concept of God and for what purpose Kant thinks we can have. I think Kant, from the standpoint of many religious people, I think they should be very cautious in thinking of Kant as he would like to try to correct some of the errors of popular religious thinking. He thinks that there are many such errors, and he thinks that popular religion has a tendency toward idolatry, anthropomorphism, and many of the more emotional sides of religion. I think Kant would, is not particularly friendly to them. So I hope that helps to explain why, the concept of God that Kant gives us is metaphysically very austere. Especially it would be if it were deistic, but he doesn't think that deism produces a religious conception. But then we have to be very careful when we realize that we're thinking symbolically when we think of God as having an understanding or will. So if you say has an infinite intellect, well, that's already thinking symbolically about God, borrowing the concept of intellect from ourselves, and then trying our best to figure out what it would be like to have an infinite intellect.
But then, I mean, just I think my question is, you say that his nature is incomprehensible to us. Maybe he wants to make this comprehensible by appealing to this symbol. So would you at least acknowledge that, well, we can comprehend it symbolically, but not metaphysically?
Well, I think when Kant says that God's nature is incomprehensible, I mean, he's trying to buy into a tradition of theology that goes back to the ancient world and is sometimes called negative theology. He doesn't want to accept simply the idea that God's nature is incomprehensible. But I think he believes that when we're thinking about God symbolically, we have to be very cautious in thinking that we have a conception of God that, would be cognitively useful for any purpose. I think Kant does think that the concept of God as an infinite intellect does have certain uses in theoretical, because he not only thinks that there is such a thing as moral belief, but there's also what he calls doctrinal belief, where he thinks that the idea of God as a possible creator of teleological ordered beings, we can use that concept for certain limited purposes. But I think there's a sense in which he does think that God's nature is incomprehensible to us. To the extent that it's comprehensible, it's only comprehensible in certain ways and to a very limited extent.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay. Do we have another question? Maybe I can jump in and ask my question, and meanwhile, while others formulate theirs if they have. I typed my question also on the chat, and here is a question. Sorry.
Yeah.
The assent regarding the moral fate that you have been introducing, suggesting, seems to imply a future-oriented state of mind, a future-related hope to rationalize our moral commitments or moral projects that could take place in some future. My question is this: in your reading of Kant, does this assent also make a difference in appreciating our current moral experience or our present state of affairs in general? In other words, does this assent make a change also in how we perceive the universe and the nature right here and right now, rather than merely rationalizing our some future moral projects or expectation? Because I think from teleological perspective, this does make a huge change, and I think Kant seems to also allow this. What is your reading on that?
Yeah, that's a good question, because when you think of the highest good as an end, well, all ends are thought of in a certain sense as future states of affairs, right? Mm-hmm. But the highest good is supposed to have to do with the structure of the world a whole and the whole of its history. Mm-hmm. So it's not just a future. It's looking at the world with both forward-looking and past-looking. So let's say if a being, a human being, let's say, has made itself worthy of a certain happiness, mm-hmm. then if it hasn't enjoyed that happiness already, then to hope for the highest good is to hope that it will again achieve the happiness of which it's made itself worthy in the future. Of course, Kant does not think that we humans are in any position to judge the worthiness of happiness for ourselves or for other human beings. That's for God to do, right? But I think you're right that there's a certain way in which the highest good is not a merely future-oriented goal. Mm-hmm. It's a goal that, of course, part of it is the future, because the world is still ongoing and making, and there's changes going on in the world. But maybe it helps to some extent to realize that the highest good is also not something that it's not an idea that we can use to decide what we ought to do. Maybe we think, well, any end ought to be like that. But in this case, it isn't, and he's very clear about that. The highest good is simply the point of unification for the ends that we set as duties, and it doesn't add to our duties at all. Mm-hmm. And so to pursue the highest good is for each of us just to do what morality would tell us to do. Mm-hmm. It doesn't give us a new goal. I think back around the time I was first writing about Kant's religion, there were some writers on this subject. John Silber was one of them, who tried to use the idea of the highest good as a way of deciding, what we should do. But in the religion, in the preface to the religion, Kant is very clear. The highest good does not tell us what we should do. It just gives us a point of unification for thinking about how our moral goals could be represented as a totality. It doesn't add to our duties at all, he says. Mm-hmm. So that makes it a little less troubling to realize that the highest good is not a future-oriented end. It's less troubling because you might worry, well, what does it tell us to do? And the answer to that is it doesn't tell us anything we didn't already know.
Mm-hmm. So, okay, thank you. So you also think that it's also teleologically unite the moral experience, not merely as a future expectation. Okay.
Yeah, well, it of course includes the future because the world, the future is part of the world, but it includes the whole world. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much. And we have two more hands, and I think I have seen Umut first. Umut Eldem, please go ahead.
Well, thank you very much for the wonderful talk. I will also post my question in chat. So, could you elaborate more on your objection to the notion of moral status, since this concept is very widely used in various branches of ethics, and mostly by thinkers or in papers who wish to draw attention to some newly emerging moral fact or problem? We see it in discussions of AI ethics, non-human animals, environment, and so on and so forth. Do you propose an alternative notion, or should we just change the entire setting of the question?
Yes, well, I think that Kantian ethics does not answer a great many questions that we might have about how animals are to be treated. For example, he doesn't tell us, for example, well, he seems to assume that animals can be used for certain purposes. He's thinking of horses and dogs in particular that are used as like they're analogous to human servants, right? But he doesn't, he assumes but does not argue that we can use animals for these purposes. Some people who are especially vegans who don't believe we could use anything that animals, not only we shouldn't eat the animals, but we shouldn't use them or their products. Well, I don't think Kant gives us any guidance about this, because the question might be, well, in what respects do we think of animals analogically in the same way that we think about human beings? Somebody might argue, well, a decent human being does not think of other human beings as fit to be killed and eaten. Well, is that a respect in which we should think of animals the same way we think about human beings? If it is, then we ought all to be vegetarians. We shouldn't eat animals. But I don't think Kant plainly took for granted the practices of his own society. I think living in Königsberg at the end of the Prego River as it goes into the Baltic Sea, he did fairly often eat fish. I don't know how often Kant ate other kinds of meat, but I don't think he had any moral objections to eating meat. There's one passage in the lectures in which Kant says, if we kill an animal for food, we should do so quickly and as painlessly as possible. This implies that he thinks that it's permissible to kill and eat animals, but it also shows some concern for the welfare of the animal. We shouldn't, and he certainly thinks that, he says, those forms of experimentation on animals that cause the animal needless pain should be avoided. And we should try to avoid using animals in experiments that cause them any pain or discomfort. So he obviously tends to think that one respect in which we should think similarly about humans and animals is that we should not cause them needless pain. Okay, well, that makes sense. But there are many questions. A lot of the questions that people are raising now are questions about how we should treat animals. And what I think is that Kant's way of approaching these things simply leaves these questions to be answered. I don't think he has a theory of them. And actually, my own view, which I tried to express briefly, at least in this talk, is I think the concept of moral status is a pernicious concept, whether it's used to talk about human beings or human beings and animals or anything else. The concept of moral status implies that we have a conception of a being, whatever the being is, and that our guidance, that conception is what primarily should guide our way of treating that being. And I don't think that's the right way to think about how to decide to treat different beings. I do think that there are certain properties that living beings have, especially sentient living beings, that should come into play. As I suggested in the talk, that pleasure and freedom from pain are ceteris paribus, that is, all other things being equal, are a consideration, and you should prefer pleasure to non-pleasure and non-pain to pain. But this is all ceteris paribus, and I pointed out a couple of ways in which we think it is perfectly acceptable in our own case, not to try to maximize pleasure and minimize pain. I think that we don't, in fact, choose to maximize pleasure and minimize pain. Many pleasures are good, but some pleasures are bad. They're bad for us. They're bad for other people. The assumption that Bentham had to make in order to keep his hedonism afloat was that the amount of total pleasure and absence of pain that can be gained from inflicting pain on somebody is always going to be greater than if you let yourself inflict pain on them. And but I don't think this is true. I mean, it's just empirically not correct. The assumption that Bentham had to make in order to make his hedonism plausible is a false assumption. Hedonism is just not a good theory of the good. And of course, you should expect a Kantian to agree with that claim, because Kant is not himself a hedonist about the good. Although he is to a limited extent, and I think, about all I think we can say about it is that pleasure and freedom from pain are ceteris paribus, all other things being equal, good. But there are many counterexamples where all things are not equal. And as I pointed out, I think the way in which Kantian ethics says that different beings should be treated has much more to do with the needs and situation of those beings and our relation to those beings than to any conception we have of the kind of being they are, or therefore anything that we might consider their moral status. And I think the way the notion of moral status has been used in human societies up to now makes it a pretty awful notion. I don't like it. It means that, upper class people are treated better than lower class people. Free people are treated better than slaves. That's the use that has been made of the concept of moral status. I want to get rid of that concept. I don't want any version of it. Of course, we have to consider the situation of different beings in deciding how to treat them. But I don't think the concept of moral status does any good to us in thinking that way.
Thank you very much for the answer.
Thank you, Professor Wood. We have one more question from Vedi Temizkan. You can read your question, Vedi Bey or Vedi Temizkan, but also Professor Wood, it's also written in the chat if you want to follow the question. No. Vedi Temizkan, would you like me to read your question or will you read your question by yourself?
Yes, I can read it.
Yeah, thank you.
My question was about nature, about our moral obligation to animals also, and so I formulate it again. I would like to ask you about our moral obligation to nature itself, and about the problem of climate change in these days. I can read it formally. As far as I know, Kant supports the superiority of human beings to the nature, and he denies the value of nature's value in itself. Then, do you think Kant provides sufficient solution for the current climate change? I would like to ask this. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Yeah, so as I've said, I think that Kant does not answer a lot of the questions. I mean, you could put the question you could put, if he were alive, you could put the question to Kant, well, if we're supposed to think in the same way about human beings that we think of animals, shouldn't we decide that we should never voluntarily kill an animal except in the same kinds of situations in which we would choose to kill a human being? And there would be very limited such situations. It might be acceptable to kill a human being if as euthanasia, as a way of if it had no purpose in going on living except its own misery and lack of dignity, then perhaps the human being could be killed for its own good in that point, and maybe you could say the same about an animal. But I think Kant took it for granted because we nearly always have done this. I mean, we have, in fact, for the most part, preferred the interests of individual animals to individual human beings to those of individual animals. And just the other day, my former colleague, Anthony Appia, I don't know if you know who he is, he's a very good philosopher, and he writes a column for the New York Times called The Ethicist, in which he answers questions, moral dilemmas usually, that people put to him. And one of the questions that he was asked is, what if you had to choose, suppose a train or a bus or a trolley or something was going to run over either your beloved pet animal, your dog or cat, or it will run over a stranger, a human being from another, perhaps from another country or somebody that's a complete stranger. Should you save your pet or should you save the stranger human being? Anthony had a very clear answer to that question. He says you should save the human being. But he cited a study that somebody made in which 40% of the people who were asked this question thought that it would be quite acceptable to choose to save your pet rather than to save a stranger, a human being. Anthony thinks that because so many people would do that, it clearly means that if you would make that choice, you wouldn't be a moral monster. You wouldn't be a terrible person necessarily. But Anthony's view is that you should definitely choose the human being over the animal, even if the animal is your beloved pet. I don't know whether we have to agree with Anthony about this, but it sounds as though, and I think this tends to be the view that people take when they decide to give animals a moral status, that animals don't get as good or as high a moral status as human beings. I think that is what Anthony, in effect, he doesn't say it in that way, but I think he is making the choice based on something like a notion of moral status. Well, I don't necessarily disagree with what he would say about that particular case, but I am questioning whether you could make that, whether you could decide that question based on any notion of moral status. See, in the examples I gave in the talk, I made it easy for myself. I said that the human being is your child, your own child, and the animal is a wild animal, you know. Suppose it's a crocodile or something like that. Well, I would sooner kill the crocodile than have the crocodile eat my child. Well, that seems kind of obvious. I would say so. However, if somebody thinks that animals, and individual animals, have the same moral status as human beings, well, I don't know. Then the answer isn't obvious anymore. And I certainly think that if between two animals, a wild animal and a pet, suppose what I have to choose is between saving a wild animal that is attacking my pet and might kill my pet, and killing the wild animal. Well, there I feel pretty comfortable saying that I should be able to kill the wild animal to save my pet, just as I would be justified in killing the wild animal to save my child. And in both cases, the relation to me, the child is my child, and the pet is my pet, a member of my household. So I think the Kantian answer always is, the first question you should ask is, what is your relation to this being? Now, Anthony obviously thinks that your relation to a pet does not justify your, choosing its life over the life of a stranger human being. That's an interesting, and I guess I'm inclined to agree with Anthony about that. But if the justification were an appeal to the idea of moral status and saying, well, animals have some moral status, but not as high as human beings, I'm worried about that solution. I don't like comparative judgments of moral status, whether you apply them to animals or to human beings. I would be more comfortable with the idea that I should save somebody who's not a stranger to me, a member of my own family. Suppose this is another kind of example that philosophers sometimes use. Suppose two people are drowning and I can only save one of them. One of them is a stranger and the other one is, let's say, my wife or my child. Well, I think the answer there is I should save my wife or child rather than the stranger. Godwin, well-known philosopher. He was the husband of Mary Wollstonecraft, who wrote important works on the rights of women, and he was the father of Mary Shelley, who wrote the book Frankenstein. Mm-hmm. Godwin thought that if you had to choose between a stranger to you who was a great benefactor of humanity, choose that between that person and your own mother, that was his example, you should choose the great benefactor of humanity. And I think he was thinking along the lines of a utilitarian. And he's thinking, well, whose life benefits the greatest good? I don't think most people don't agree with Godwin about that. Most people think that you should save the member of your family. Fichte discusses that kind of case, and I tend to agree with what he says about it. He says that you have been assigned by your role in society to be the protector of certain people, your spouse, your children, your parents, he even thinks your family's servants. All of these people have a claim on you that a stranger does not have, even if the stranger should be a great benefactor to humanity. It's not your job to choose who is going to be the greatest benefactor to humanity. It is your job to care for the people to whose welfare has been left in your care. And I tend to agree with Fichte about that. Now, I don't know how this is supposed to help us decide about, human beings and animals. But the point I'd want to make about Kantian ethics is that Kant doesn't answer these questions. Maybe there are good Kantian answers that are clear in one direction or another. I have Kantian friends who are vegans and vegetarians. Some are vegans and some are vegetarians on what they consider to be Kantian grounds. And I have a lot of other Kantian friends who eat meat and think that Kant can defend that. I don't know what the right answer from a Kantian point of view is about that. But I also think that the notion of moral status isn't a very helpful one.
Yeah, that's true. Okay. Do we have another question? I'm checking the audience. Okay, maybe I should just thank you one more time. Professor Wood, honestly, I have been personally very happy to meet you in person, and I'm sure that everybody here now is very happy to meet you because we have been reading your books and articles for years, and you kindly accepted our invitation and made this special occasion even more special. So I want to say happy birthday, Kant. And also, I want to thank you really sincerely, Professor Wood, for joining us tonight and this morning for you. Thank you so much.
Okay, well, thank you for inviting me. And thank you for your questions.
Okay, thank you. And I would like to thank everybody who joined us tonight and did not leave us alone. And as Türkiye Kant Society, we would like to meet you on some other occasions. Good night, everyone. And good morning, Professor Wood. Bye-bye.
Okay, all right.